Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Let me see. Let's see if I'm... Hello, let's see. Wait a minute. All right. Better? Okay. All right. Good morning. Good morning. As always, thank you for that lovely respected country. That for me, as a person who comes from Puerto Rico, where our indigenous people were almost entirely genocided, and who follows the struggles of indigenous people, all over the world, pay respects to that struggle, and also understand that that struggle is also our struggle. It's a struggle of all people who are committed to social justice. So I'm happy to be with you. I also want to thank Peter Roberts and David Small in particular for their efforts to bring me out here, for their hospitality, their graciousness. They're the kind of comrades we need in this struggle. So let me begin. I want to just say to you that this work that I'm presenting is a work that's in development. So it's really a wonderful time to present it in a symposium kind of context, right? Because it's not fully formed. It's being developed even as I'm speaking. So I'm excited about presenting it and really looking forward to our dialogue together. It was a bit long, so I've tried to actually try to cut it down because I think that the dialogue is such an important part of this work. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. So let me begin by saying that more than 40 years ago, Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was first released in English. The inequalities and injustices that he was addressing then continue to persist in the United States and around the globe. In many instances, these conditions have worsened in the last 2 decades with the infusion of neoliberal policies related to privatization, deregulation, and the free market enterprise and its movement into education. Thus, it's important to begin our discussion with the legacy of Paulo Freire in conjunction with the economy, in that often it has been precisely Freire's revolutionary critique of capitalism and the link of schooling to class struggle that has been stripped away, resulting in watered-down, diluted versions of his revolutionary ideas, and that often does not even come into play when we talk about issues of educational leadership. Moreover, as a scholar of color who was born a colonized subject in Puerto Rico and reared in abject poverty in the United States, there's no way that anyone can convince me that the center of gravity of oppression for those of us deemed as other is simply the psychological aberration of white people toward our so-called race. Rather, I argue that racism experienced by the colonized is intimately linked to the material domination and exploitation of our lands and our communities by the wealthy and powerful elite, and enacted by the most part by those who are not themselves affluent, but who answer each day that siren call. And this is particularly, what I'm noting here is the impact of the manner in which those hegemonic apparatus of society, particularly with respect to the political economy, result in major inequalities with respect to the economy. In the process, those deemed as other have been reduced to objects or things to be manipulated as a reserve army of workers or soldiers to defend both the economic and military agendas of the wealthy and powerful. Traditional education springing out of the one-dimensionality of advanced capitalism has often served to reproduce what Aimé Césaire called thingification, when he expressed great concern for the destruction of communities, societies, and nations, for the millions of men and women torn from their gods, their lands, their habits, their life, from the dance, from wisdom. As a young woman reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it changed the course of my life as an educator and political activist. Freire challenged us to truly embody our commitment to political consciousness and social transformation within the relationships that we forge with those within and outside of our cultural communities. When we recognized at the core, what we recognized was that the pedagogy of the oppressed was not only for the classroom, but rather a living pedagogy that had to be infused into all aspects of our lives, including our politics and our labor as so-called educational leaders. This was particularly of concern in that economic policies that bolstered poverty and racism, for example, have a devastating impact far beyond classroom life. Whoops, we just go back. There. And what this is, it shows you what has happened in relationship to incarceration in the United States. And if you look, when you really see the increasing incarceration, and I want to just make this point out, you know, we talk about neoliberalism and policies, you see that right at the moment in the mid-'80s when neoliberal policies in the US really begin to take off in education and in other parts of the society, you can see the increase in incarceration that's correlated. Another piece that is correlated is the increase, for example, in the concentration of wealth. So the increase in poverty and the increase of concentration of wealth, along with the increase in incarceration, can actually be correlated in relationship to neoliberal policies. So I want to say that for people such as myself and others who have been betrayed by our schooling, Freire offered the possibility of an educational project for our children and our communities tied to a larger democratic vision, one that resonated with our anti-colonial struggles for self-determination and our desire to control our own destinies. Towards this end, Freire's writings challenged oppressive ideas, attitudes, structures, and practices within education and the process of leadership that perpetuated colonizing values of white superiority, patriarchy, class privilege, language domination, victim blaming, and so on. However, with the eclipse of the multicultural age in education, persisting problems and concerns raised by communities of color for almost a century now fall on deaf ears as there's been backlash and the instrumental ideology of neoliberal education policies that have created limited matrices of accountability, which deliberately discount historical and contemporary community concerns related to culture, to language, to poverty, pedagogy, and power. Instead, the numbers game of high-stakes testing, the standardization of knowledge, and the teaching to the test are the order of the day, shrouded today in the institutionalization of common core standards that we have in the United States. So there's a common, you know, this standardization of knowledge in such a way that it actually ends up limiting the rationality that we find within the curriculum and allowing the hidden curriculum to be very much bolstered. Consequently, we find ourselves more deeply mired in Western ethnocentric or kind of universalized notions of humanity, where individualism, object-based, future focus, and materialism counter the legitimacy of subordinate cultural community values and traditions. Additionally, this leads to the negation of our worldviews, including the marginalization of communal life, ancestral knowledge, or spiritual traditions that might enhance the teaching and learning of all our children. Such marginalization continues to echo the historical project of colonization, anchored in a conceptual narrative and societal design that legitimates and naturalizes the cultural, economic, and military domination, exploitation, and dispossession of the majority of the world's population in the name of democracy, progress, and profit. There's no question then that the dehumanizing currents of the contemporary neoliberal agenda, which show global trends of increasing inequalities, requires us to grapple seriously with the struggle of our humanity in the face of oppressive forces that seek to colonize every aspect of our lives from birth to death. Our capacity to live free then requires a fundamental shift in how educators and leaders define our lives, the conditions of our labor, and the moral precepts by which we struggle in the world. And when I use the sense of leaders, I think of ourselves all as leaders of our lives and leaders of our communities. This is particularly essential for oppressed populations in that, as Assata Shakur reminds us, nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who were oppressing them. All this points to the need for a leadership process of radicalization, which entails problematizing our world in ways that can move us toward a critical praxis of leadership. Grounded in a in Freire, a critical praxis of critical leadership emerges from a political understanding that not even the best intentioned leadership can bestow independence as a gift. The liberation of the oppressed is the liberation of women and men, not things. Accordingly, no one liberates himself by his own efforts alone, neither is he or she liberated by others. Hence, Freire warned against forms of leadership that ascribe to the banking line of planning program content from the top down, and instead emphasize that revolutionary process is dynamic, and it is in this continuing dynamics, in the praxis of the people with revolutionary leaders, that the people and the leaders will learn from both dialogue and the use of power. So there's this sense that what we're talking about here is a dialectical and a dialogical understanding of what we mean by leadership with respect to our work. The dehumanizing impact of social and material inequalities perpetrated by banking forms of leadership upon populations around the world impels us to unveil the hidden ideological values and anti-dialogical approaches that inform the development and use of standardized curriculum, materials, textbooks, testing, assessment tools, promotion criteria, and institutional relationships in an effort to support and better infuse our notions of educational leadership with a decolonizing vision of schools and community life. In so doing, the task at hand then is not to reproduce traditional social arrangements of accountability that support the madness of testing, but rather create and enhance opportunities to learn in the interests of self-determination and culturally democratic life. Furthermore, the unwillingness to suspend belief in the superiority of Western culture attached to class, racialized, patriarchal, and heterosexist codes of conduct and assumptions has been one of the most difficult issues that activists and educators of color have confronted when trying to create alliances across dominant-subordinate divides. But what is clear for those of us who have remained in this retracted struggle is this: if there is to be a genuinely decolonizing approach to educational leadership, it demands a critical theory of leadership for social justice and community empowerment. This speaks to an emancipatory vision that embraces the indigenous call of idle no more and extends beyond schools, where the critical involvement and full participation of educators, parents, students, and members from historically marginalized communities is central to a decolonizing practice of leadership in education. Inherent then to a critical vision of leadership is a set of principles and ethical commitments that inform this project. Here, just briefly, I will move through some of the ideas that are slowly evolving into a critical foundation or a Freirean foundation for educational leadership studies. I'm going to begin with the notion that critical leadership is pedagogical. I mean, this is something that Freire, from the very beginning, from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he spoke about. This notion moves us away from the hierarchical and individualistic banking model of leadership to one that understands leadership as a social phenomena that exists in community and evolves pedagogically through communal structures of participation. The vision here is to learn together as a way of life, in which we transform the world as community through a humanizing praxis of inquiry and decision-making, which also informs the practices that ensue. In concert, Freire argued, for apart from inquiry, apart from praxis, individuals cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through our invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. The next piece is the notion of critical leadership that requires moral commitment. I think we've advanced one. Thank you. We'll get it together. I'm so grateful. Thank you. In a Pedagogy of Freedom, Freire asserts that human existence is in fact a radical and profound tension between good and evil, between dignity and indignity, between decency and indecency, between the beauty and ugliness of the world. An unwillingness to contend then with deep moral questions within educational institutions and the larger society has resulted in the bureaucracy of schools, where schools are ruled by absolute top-down and expedient policies that do little to attend to the larger societal institutional conditions of which social problems are a symptom. For example, good educators, human development folks, and even neuroscientists all understand that human beings, and particularly children, need physical contact to connect and enhance the maturation of the brain. I mean, this is known. In fact, babies who are not touched can die from a condition called infantile marasmus, where the baby emaciates and shuts down due to the lack of touch. Yet in our schools, rather than to contend with the fact that according to the recent study commissioned by the US Department of Education, more than 4.5 million students are subject to sexual misconduct by an employee of a school sometime between kindergarten and 12th grade, expedient, reactionary, and one-dimensional no-touch policies are instituted at the expense of the emotional well-being of our children. While in the meantime, the isolating structures of teaching, the authoritarian nature of traditional schooling, and the silencing of students' voices, three features directly tied with this outdated efficiency factory system of schooling, permits pedophiles to go undetected, go unaddressed in the name of urgency and expediency. And I hope that what I'm saying here is that rather than deal with what are the conditions that would allow somebody to molest children and not be detected, right? What is going on in the way that schools are structured, right? Instead of engaging that in terms of how teachers are isolated, how students find very little room to complain or to speak, the issues that they're struggling with in the classroom. Instead, what they do is simply come to this, no-touch rule. And the consequence is that it actually interferes with the intellectual development of children. Hence, a critical theory of leadership must be founded on an understanding that critical leadership is a political act which calls for change and social transformation. As such, it is a question-posing approach to leadership that recognizes that culture and power are inextricably linked to the system of organization. That said, there must be consistent and humanizing protocols for examining in an ongoing and organic manner the consequences of decisions that are made and their impact upon the most disenfranchised. So many of the questions that we need to ask are, what are the consequences of the policies and practices that we perpetuate in our schools and in our society? Through such a process, a critical leadership for social justice must create the conditions for those who are most affected to question why. This in itself must serve as a revolutionary ethos of organizational life. For as Freire reminds us, no oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why. As such, this is a vision of leadership that moves beyond neutrality in the face of oppressed policies and practices. Instead, a communal process of leadership opens the way for honest questioning, open expression of voice, multiple forms of participation, and genuine structures of democratic decision-making guided by a moral imperative and solidarity that is inextricably tied to the potential consequences of policy decisions and practices upon the most disenfranchised. Thus, the purpose of critical leadership first and foremost encompasses a number of traits. Some of these, an uncompromising commitment to the empowerment and self-determination of the most vulnerable and disenfranchised. The transformation of relationships, institutional structures, and material conditions that perpetuate domination and reproduce all forms of inequality and social exclusions. And an ethos of educational practice that nurtures and cultivates democratic life for all. This underlying purpose of education then embraces the Freudian notion that the greatest humanistic and historical task of the oppressed is to liberate ourselves. Community empowerment as a dialectical process is another important part of this understanding. Hence, there must always remain a dialectical tension between the needs of the individual and larger social needs. This tension permits for individual participation in the evolution of a collective process of community self-determination that does not degenerate into moral relativism, but rather is informed by a humanizing moral compass guided by love for self, others, and the world. It is this dialectical tension that can also help thwart absolutism, driven by apolitical and ahistorical readings of the world. In this vision of leadership, critical dialogue is the political means for empowerment and establishing participatory communication and participatory community. This entails then the following: purposeful communication that leads to self-determination and political action, a collective process of conscientization, communal labor that supports the development of solidarity, an open and humanizing process of inquiry. Freire stated that any situation in which some men prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. To alienate humans from their own decision-making, then, is to change them into objects. At the point that we're not allowed to make decisions about the destiny of our own lives, at the point that others are not also involved in deciding upon their own lives, at that point, people are rendered objects in the sense that they're supposed to acquiesce to whatever decision is kind of handed down in relationship to their lives. Unfortunately, in institutions, often people are asked very little about their labor. So teachers, for example, are often, given all sorts of new programs, new projects, new curriculum, new activities that they were in no way involved in creating, and are then just, curriculum that they're just now expected to move through and to have no feelings about. So I can tell you, for example, with a Common Core in the States, one of the biggest problems was the anger that teachers experience, and it was rightly so. It was rightly so, because suddenly they were handed all this curricular material, and their whole day in relationship with teaching was shifted and changed without adequate preparation, but more importantly, without their participation at all with respect to what would be going on in their classrooms. So they had a right to be. Most of us would be pissed, right, upset. Most of us would be angry, if suddenly your everyday life was completely shifted and moved around by those you didn't even have any relationship with or conversation with, when you had not even been asked, is this a better way to do it? Is this really what my students need? Okay. As would be expected then, a critical pedagogical principles of conscientization or conscientização, as Freire is a term that Freire used in Portuguese. It defines the ongoing aim and practice of critical leadership. This requires us to remain ever vigilant in our continuing evolution as cultural workers as we seek to practice with a greater sense of critical social consciousness. This points to this personal consciousness of one's individual conditions and social location, social consciousness of the conditions that impact communities, understanding how these two dimensions intersect, awareness of how power relationships inform cultural, political, social, and economic conditions, and thus the strategies that we use for intervention, and embrace our individual and social responsibility as cultural citizens and subjects of our own history. However, none of this is possible without an ongoing process of critical democratic negotiation, where the dialectical tension between authority and freedom are engaged organically within the actual context where these tensions arise. The dialectical tension between authority and freedom is simply a part of the human condition, according to Freire. About this, Freire insists it's not possible to have authority without freedom or vice versa. Hence, we must be willing to practice a critical form of leadership that demands our full presence beyond vulgar competition, infantilizing micromanagement, or egotistical ambitions and pursuit for institutional recognition. As such, a critical theory of leadership calls for personal vigilance and political groundedness within the context of communal life. These critical qualities assist us to read the world more accurately, particularly with respect to the ideological intersections at work in all organizational structures. We can think of this theoretically as an axis relationship, where there is an intersection between the continuum of tyranny and powerlessness on one hand, and the continuum of absolute authority and absolute freedom on another. And people within organizations can fall at any point on this axis. This is important to the struggle of social justice and community empowerment, precisely because people in any organization will exhibit different response patterns across these continuums, depending on their political coherence, their grounded experience, their cultural worldview, and their personal and communal depth of commitment to social justice. In concert with Freire's philosophy, engaging then the cultural context is essential to our efforts, in that often the hegemony of dominant worldview functions systematically to marginalize other ways of being. This phenomenon is what prompted Freire to argue one cannot expect positive results from an educational or political action program which fails to respect the particular view of the people held by the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion, good intentions notwithstanding. Another significant dimension of critical theory of leadership is a commitment to relationships of solidarity that nurture through the integration of our human faculties. The evolution of what I call political grace is this collective power that's generated by those who committed together to struggle for democratic life, seek to connect through communal relationships. So this sense of this force, this relationship that unfolds, and it actually creates a collective power that allows us then to use our collective social agency together. So it's another way of thinking of it. Moreover, given its emancipatory purpose, revolutionary community practice requires the exercise of this integral process, one in which the mind, heart, body, and spirit are welcome in the active service of liberation. As such, a critical theory of leadership must encompass a pedagogical purpose that aims to prepare and support us to live with greater political grace, or eros, as George Casaficas mentions in his political work. A force that connects us to both our material conditions and locates us in solidarity with one another. It's a sense that we are interdependent and that we're going to change the world, we're going to change our communities, we're going to change organizations. We need one another. We need to work together. Although this is not an easy task given the depth of alienation we experience today, it is key to our understanding the obstacles we face, and that it is precisely the fragmenting and fracturing of our human faculties that thwart our collective political agency, as the culture of consumption steers our passions towards abstracted individual pursuits, manufactured desires, all in the interests of profit. Hence, political grace is also linked to the individual social agency required to break with what Freire called the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, the internalization of elite attitudes and practices that perpetuate structures of inequality, even when it is blatantly against our own interests. For Freire, then, the question of ethics is at the very forefront of his thinking. This point is made obvious, particularly in his book, Pedagogy of Freedom, Ethics, Democracy, and Civic Courage. Two particularly significant points in his argument are, one, his countering of determinism, and two, the assumption of responsibility despite the conditioned elements that exist in our lives. About this, he argued, I am a pure product of genetic, cultural, or class determination. I have no responsibility if I am a pure product of genetic, cultural, or class determination. I have no responsibility for my action in the world, and therefore it is not possible for me to speak of ethics. Of course, this assumption of responsibility does not mean that we are not conditioned genetically, culturally, and socially. It means that we know ourselves to be conditioned, but not determined. Yet Freire recognized that this unfinishedness is essential to our human condition. As such, the fact that we know ourselves to be unfinished beings within our histories and contexts of oppression, as much as our yearning for freedom, calls us to be both humble and self-vigilant, in that we recognize that unexamined attitudes and practices of racism, sexism, disableism, or homophobia bypass consciousness and often attach to default or unacknowledged authoritarian expressions of everyday life, particularly when we become defensive or become threatened in a particular context. With this in mind, we start from the realization that we all live in an unfree and unequal world. Hence, our struggle for our humanity can only evolve from our struggle for the emancipation of labor and overcoming our alienation as we affirm ourselves as full subjects of history. However, the pursuit of an ethically humanizing praxis of leadership cannot be carried out in isolation or as individuals, but only through the fellowship and solidarity of communities working for change. These relationships of solidarity built through collective labor must remain central to our politics and a critical pedagogy of leadership, given that human beings in communion liberate each other. This understanding of critical leadership as a collective understanding has resonated deeply and powerfully with those who have been historically dispossessed and have had little institutional power or influence over their life conditions, given the oppressive contradictions and social constructions and constrictions at work in capitalist societies. Freire also often called to mind this power of unfinishedness as a significant radical view in diminishing fatalism and inspiring hope in new possibilities for collective change among the oppressed. The recognition of our human unfinishedness also can help us to unveil the hidden or silenced contradictions at work behind what Freire termed limit situations, contradictions that we must challenge and overcome in our efforts to reinvent schools and communities. At the heart of this concept is recognition that oppression is never a permanent condition, and it is indeed because no human condition is ever absolute or finished, that the struggle remains viable and hope fertile, even within political and material conditions that appear desolate and barren at times. Freire explained, if this world were a created finished world, it would no longer be susceptible to transformation. The human being exists as such, and the world is a historical cultural one because the two come together as unfinished products in a permanent relationship in which human beings transform the world and undergo the effects of their transformation. In this dynamic historical cultural process, one generation encounters the objective reality marked out by another generation and receives through it the imprints of reality. For Freire, our capacity for emancipatory praxis requires that a fundamental shift in those imprints by which we define the purpose of leadership and the conditions of our labor, that it's necessary then for us to redefine it. This requires moving beyond the internalization of our oppression, the ejection of colonizing ideologies of domination, the establishment of solidarity, the recognition of ourselves as historical subjects, the courage to speak out when necessary, and a well-developed sense of empowerment in order that we might name, critique, decolonize, and reinvent the world anew in the interest of a truly just future. In waging struggles for social change, Freire considered it imperative that we all come to understand that domination does not exist within then a closed world from where there is no exit. Instead, the struggle is possible only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. So with that, I want to kind of end with just this last little piece on what I call indispensable qualities of critical leadership. And for those who know Freire, it was a term that he liked to use, indispensable qualities of teaching, of pedagogy, in that he often thought we needed to think about what are the ethics and the qualities that helped us to move in ways that would allow us to be in integrity with our political dreams and our revolutionary vision. So I want to quickly offer two overlapping sets of indispensable qualities of critical leadership. And the first is tied to an ethics of political struggle, and the other is to personal struggle, and understanding that these very much are overlapping. So the qualities I think of as an ethics of political struggle include a knowledge of the micro and macro systems and their relationships, knowledge of the self-contradictions and personal struggles, recognize the link between culture and power, ability to read power, both formal and impersonal, conscious of language use and relationship to power and its impact on others, emphasis on voice, democratic participation, and collaborative decision-making, consistently moving towards dialogue, enacting a critical authority in the interest of democratic life, being politically strategic and choosing the battles wisely, right? Which also means that we have to be able to move beyond the ego, because sometimes people can make us really angry, but truly it's nothing about the issue. It's just more of a, we're responding more at a personal level than really responding to the issue, which really requires a great deal of steadiness, I think, to not let ourselves get all caught up at that level. Anyway, commitment to solidarity and community self-determination, political change that's understood as part of an ongoing process of life, and embracing historical long view, a revolutionary struggle for social justice. And this issue of long view is, to me, a central one, because often people get very, very disappointed when they are involved in any kind of struggle. Whether it be institutional or community struggle, larger social movement struggle, and they feel they lose, like, oh, we lost, And for me, I think that that's part of what we have to, by having a long view of historical struggle, what happens is we understand that each of our acts and each of the moments of struggle are part of this long continuum of human beings who have been struggling for our humanity, struggling for our emancipation. We're not the only ones that have been thinking about it. People have been thinking about this, for centuries on. And so I think we need to see ourselves as part of this long historical trajectory, and that the struggles that we're waging now have an impact on the struggles that will be waged later. And sometimes, I think about the situation at the University of Illinois, just as a little tiny example, where they insisted on having this kind of fabricated mascot. And they would do this crazy, kind of supposed to be indigenous dance at the basketball games and the football games and stuff. But the truth of it was all fabricated. In fact, the crazy thing is that it was fabricated by a man who was a former president of the Ku Klux Klan student group in the early 1900s. This is how bizarre some of the ways these things happen, but if we don't know the history of them, right? So indigenous students, along with other students, began to struggle in the 80s to try to get rid of the mascot, right? And, it took 25 years. I was fortunate that I was at the latter part of that struggle. And so I worked with students, and we finally were able to bring that, the end to the chief mascot at UIUC. But, do I think that I did it, or just the students that I worked with? No, that struggle was this long 25-year historical struggle. And what they did then, even though they felt they had lost 20 years before, 25 years before, they had not. In fact, what they had done is that had primed the way in order to allow us to bring an end to that mascot. So I just want to say that, kind of end this little section here with Freire, one of the things that he often said is that the oppressors do not favor promoting the community as whole, but rather selected leaders. And so for me, that's an important element, that we have to think about in relationship to any kind of revolutionary leadership or any kind of critical leadership or dialogical leadership. And when we say revolutionary, when Freire talked about revolution, he was really talking about a dialogical form of leadership, a leadership that understood that it could not be that kind of traditional hierarchical notion, top down, but it had to be an engagement with community. The second set then of indispensable qualities of critical leadership and tied to an ethics of personal struggle for social justice include the following. So knowledge of our personal struggles and limitations, self-vigilant in our attitudes and behaviors towards self, others, and the world, being committed to the common good. And in Tucson, there was a major struggle that went on, and I just want to say this notion of tú eres mi otro yo. It comes from an indigenous notion of understanding that each of us, that you are my other me. Tú eres mi otro yo. So when I engage you as you are my other me, there is inherent in that relationship then a sense of kinship in all contexts. And so this notion then, committed to the common good, means that in a sense that we begin to understand each other as interconnected and needing one another, irrespective of how we come to the struggle. That at the end, it is something that we have to come to together. To have faith and respect for others, to present and engage styles of communication, to be present and engage styles of communication and participation in ways that allow us to bring our presence to the table. Courageous and thoughtful when challenging others, exercise a collective sensibility in decision-making with others. Freire would say being impatiently patient with respect to progress, the sense that, we have to be patient in terms of what's going on, but there always should be this kind of this edge, this impatience, in that we're not satisfied. So it's not a kind of patience with satisfaction, but it's almost that we know that there's more that has to be done. Commitment to living and working and loving with integrity, to focus on nurturing relationships rather than being right. Sometimes people get so caught up in wanting to prove that they're right that they actually destroy relationships that are needed. They destroy relationships among people who are supposed to be our allies. We on the left in particular have not done a good job of this. And I think that was one of Freire's greatest concerns, is that we needed to understand that we needed to find ways to struggle and to engage issues of differences in ways that would not destroy our solidarity. So the sense of unity and difference, how do we make that happen in terms of our work? How do we do it in our classrooms? How do we do it out in our communities? To be grounded in a revolutionary love, anchored in justice and our humanity. And forgiveness for one's own and others' limitations and mistakes. You know, I know it's hard to forgive, but damn it, you know, at some point we have to be able to forgive each other. It's like, all of us mess up. I don't, you know, maybe there's somebody in this room who hasn't messed up or who hasn't, you know, even with good intentions, made some mistakes that actually were hurtful to others. But at some point, we have to engage with a certain level of political forgiveness if, in fact, there is a commitment to take responsibility and to engage with what we need to do in relationship for working together. A compassion for struggles that are faced in our efforts to become more fully conscious. I don't know about you, but I've been doing this work for 40 years. I've been involved in kind of different community political stuff for almost 50 years. I can't even believe it. I mean, I was like a kid, you know? And all I can say is that it is not, you know, being a conscious human being and engaging consciously in our classrooms and even in our relationships, particularly in our personal relationships at times. This takes work and it takes commitment from us, but I don't know any other way for us to come to this work. That we need to have a respect for the preciousness of all life, that sometimes we forget. You know, that if we talk about our humanity, we're also talking about life as it exists in all forms, and that we must embrace humor, joy, and the central dimensions of our humanity, because it is through joy and it's through laughing and sometimes just being completely silly that allows us to you know, that gives us a bit of room to deal with the painfulness and the suffering of injustice that exists. I mean, when I think of all the things I've had to go through in my life, if I had not, I would say that laughter was the one thing. Having people in my life that I could laugh with and that I could just be totally, you know, who knew me, who understood me, who weren't there to judge me, and could kid around with me and tease me, and that I could tease them. I mean, it sounds like a silly thing, but to engage with each other in that way. I mean, one of the things that I love about being in a number of indigenous communities is that I swear the kind of humor, cheeky humor, you know, and it's a survival strategy. And I think that we could use a lot more of that cheeky kind of, you know, humor at the very same time that we are very grounded politically and serious about our work. In the book Heart of Men, Eric Fromm, this is back in '64, right? He probably would have named it differently today. But anyway, he argued, it is on the assumption that humans are sheep, that the great inquisitors and the dictators have built their systems. More than that, this very belief that humans are sheep and hence need leaders to make decisions for them has often given leaders the sincere conviction that they were fulfilling a moral duty, even though a tragic one. In contrast, a critical leadership for social justice and community empowerment encompasses a deep commitment in theory and practice to struggle with rather than for, in that revolutionary leadership cannot unfold without the people nor for the people, but only with the people. In concert with this commitment, then, let us seek to build an understanding of leadership and unity that embodies the spirit of Freire's words when he said, the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality so that knowing it better, he or she can transform it. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into a dialogue with them. This person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor of history or of all people or the liberator of the oppressed. But he or she does commit himself or herself within history to fight at their side. Thank you.